William Arthur Galston has been a senior fellow with the Brookings Institution since 2006 and a columnist for the Wall Street Journal for the past 12 years. In the first paragraph of his latest 161-page book, he tells us what the book is about. Quote, "This book advances this proposition that what I call the dark passions, anger, hatred, humiliation, resentment, fear, and the drive for domination fuels today's attacks on liberal democracy." Galston also says persuasive public speech is the main way demagogues mobilize these passions to pursue power. The actual name of the book is Anger, Fear, Domination. Bill Galston, when you were 16 years old, you were in the audience at Yale University when John Kennedy gave a speech. Why did that have such an impact on you?
Well, in that speech, in addition to a very funny riff on Harvard and Yale, which, since you're from the Midwest, I'll spare you. President Kennedy said in that speech that the ideological problems of the past are gone, and that what we now face is a series of technical questions that experts can help the government solve or at least manage. And that sense that the end of ideology had been reached and that we're in a period of new consensus politics, shaped me and made my bewilderment when exactly the reverse happened, all the more difficult to explain. In the space of less than a decade, we'd gone from a period of consensus to a period of ideological contestation and contestation on the streets. What happened? And I guess that started me down the road to a career in political science, political philosophy, and ultimately involvement in politics.
Why did you go in the Marine Corps?
Why did I go into the Marine Corps? Well, the short end of the story answer would be I got to the Chicago Induction Center. I was eligible for the draft after President Johnson withdrew the deferment for graduate students. I was in graduate school at the University of Chicago, and it turned out that some of the Marine volunteers had not passed the mental qualification test. I thought, in my sort of jokey graduate student way, that it was sort of like Catch-22, that if you volunteered for the Marines, you ultimately flunked the mental test. But so I was selected out of a straggly group of potential recruits into the Army to go into the Marine Corps instead. And so talk about cultural whiplash. One day I'm finishing up my master's degree at the University of Chicago. The second, I'm standing in a very stark concrete field, being greeted by a 6'4", Hawaiian, very scary drill instructor. And if the point was to instill fear, it worked magnificently. It was a great learning experience for this boy from an academic family who had never, unlike a lot of the other people who volunteered for the Marines, had never been particularly interested in doing the things that these kids who joined the Marines voluntarily had done all their lives. So suddenly, from being at the head of the class, I was at the rear of the pack, and it was a real struggle just to keep up. Now, but there's a political question in back of your biographical question, and that is, why did I go into the Marine Corps? Why didn't I take the forms of evasive action that were available to my peers, many of whom used those tactics? And the answer was, I thought the war was stupid, but not in the strong sense immoral. And therefore, I couldn't make a good faith argument to myself that I had grounds to either object conscientiously or evade. But there was something else going on. And that is, at that point, I was a graduate student in political philosophy. And I had dedicated my life to the idea that I'd be standing in front of classes talking about issues such as political obligation, the duties of citizens, etc. And I didn't think I could do that with a straight face. If when a difficult question had been posed to me, I ducked it. I just didn't think I didn't think that I could live that way. And so I made a choice that a lot of my peers questioned at the time, and which I acknowledge could be questioned from a range of legitimate points of view, but made it, and I carried it through.
How long were you in the Marine Corps?
2 years. There were efforts to get me to sign up for OCS, Officer Candidate School, but frankly, that would have meant an extra year or probably two. And assuming that I survived my 2 years in the Marines, I wanted that to be it. I'd served my country, and then I wanted to get back to my life. I should also add that my draft notice appeared in my mailbox 2 weeks to the day before my bride and I were scheduled to be married. That was, talk about throwing a grenade into people's lives. And, so I had to scramble to get a brief continuation from the draft board so that I could get married and wind up my affairs at the University of Chicago. But then that was it. One day in graduate school, the next day in boot camp.
I didn't mention earlier that the reason you were in the audience at Yale for the John F. Kennedy speech is your father taught there.
That's correct. Absolutely.
And what did he teach?
He was a biologist. But he was always interested in science and public affairs. And it turned out that as the war progressed, some of the work that he did as a very young biologist produced a precursor to the chemical that ultimately became Agent Orange. And so he felt an increasing sense of responsibility as the war went on, to make sure that science wasn't, as he saw it, misused, to damage other people's lives unnecessarily. So it was, it was in the air. Let me put it that way.
Bill Clinton, Al Gore, Walter Mondale, John Anderson. What do those names mean to you?
Well, I worked in the campaign of all of them, starting in 1980. And then my longest stint was as Walter Mondale's policy director for 2.5 years during his presidential campaign. You're looking at the unindicted co-conspirator on the famous Mondale tax increase proposal, and I have a few other notches in a belt that I don't wear very often. I worked for Al Gore in 1988, and then again in 2000. People forget that he sought the presidential nomination in 1988. But most importantly, I was one of the people who helped to fashion the agenda that Bill Clinton ran on. And I ended up in the White House the same day that he entered the White House as second in command on the Domestic Policy Council, with responsibility for wide swaths of issues. My fellow deputy, who served in a number of additional administrations, Bruce Reed, had responsibility for the other half of domestic policy, and that was quite an education. I lateraled into government at a very high level. I'd never done official government service before.
How much of this, it's a small book with lots and lots of stuff in it. how much of what you've learned in your life, whether it's the Marine Corps or working on these campaigns, has impacted what you wrote in this little book?
Oh, all of it, in ways that in ways that I'd find perhaps hard to describe. But there is a life of experience, for good or ill, poured into the confines of a 150-page book, because as an academic, I've been privileged to see things and do things that a lot of my fellow academics haven't. Some of it happened by accident, the rest by design. I was always passionately interested in both politics and the life of the mind. And to a rare extent, I've had the opportunity to combine those two passions, and then to see how they came together. And a number of my earlier books, this is my 11th, a number of my earlier books also showed the impact of my earlier political experiences.
This will be a little long, but when I read your book, I could remember my own limited experience in college with philosophers. You had to take philosophy, but I'm going to read to you. I just wrote them down separately, all these names. And then I want to come back eventually and ask you about some of them and how it relates. Rousseau, Thomas Hobbes, St. Augustine, John Stuart Mill, Reinhold Niebuhr, Montesquieu, John Locke, Aristotle, Voltaire. All these names are in your book in one way or the other. John Maynard Keynes, Herodotus, Xerxes, Achilles, Athena, Agamemnon, Nietzsche, Plato, Montaigne, Thoreau, Emerson, Tocqueville, Martha Nussbaum, who is still with us, and a friend of yours, I gather, George Orwell, Lenny Riefenstahl, Socrates, Mark Antony, Julius Caesar, William Shakespeare, Kant, Hannah Arendt, Karl Marx. There were more, but I did that just because the book is full of references to these people or quotes. How much do you know about each one of those?
More about some than others, but
name a couple that are big for you.
Aristotle's probably the biggest. And, a lot of the psychological analysis that I do in the book is a kind of reflection on a book that Aristotle wrote called The Rhetoric, which, as it sounds, is on the surface a manual of public speaking. But when you go a little bit beneath the surface, and you don't have to go very far, you see that Aristotle is analyzing not only the role of reason in politics, but also the role of passion in politics. And he speaks about anger and fear in ways that deeply influenced me. Similarly, and this came as a bit of a surprise to me because I didn't study Augustine that carefully, but the harder I reflected on my political experiences, past and present, the more significant Augustine's core concept of the libido dominandi, the urge to dominate, this drive to dominate, became. Not because all human beings have it to some extent, but some have it to a much greater than average extent. We are not all created equal in our desire to dominate others. And I guess as I reflected on current events, I decided that my book would not be complete without some extended exploration of that theme, and that drove me to Augustine. I didn't have to be driven to Aristotle. I was already there. I didn't have to be driven to Plato's dialogues on rhetoric and demagoguery. I was already there. Augustine was a bit of a reach, but frankly, all of the names that you listed are names of people whom I've studied at one time or another and who have influenced me in a range of ways. You referred to the great economist and economic theorist John Maynard Keynes. Well, I made in my book a very specific use of him, not as an economist, but as an advisor to the British government during the at Versailles, when the end of, the terms of the post-World War II, post-World War I world were being negotiated and then imposed on Germany. And Keynes wrote an entire book warning the victors that if they punished Germany to the extent that they were planning to, that they were going to get a backlash, and that it was a very dangerous road down which they were proceeding. And that is part of the section of the book that I'm actually quite proud of, where I talk historically about the way in which what nations perceive as a national humiliation can motivate them, to become revanchists, to get revenge, and to build themselves back up to the heights from which they believe they were unjustly toppled.
For at least 12 years, you have written a column for the Wall Street Journal.
Right.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but your politics wouldn't seem to me not to be the page, the editorial page itself. But I want you to tell us what your politics are at this stage, because you did work for John Anderson. But how did you get called to do the column, and why do you do the column in the Wall Street Journal?
Well, how did I get called? You'll have to ask the editor of that section of the paper, Paul Gigot, why he called me. But that's how it happened. Out of the blue, he called me. And I think there's a backstory here. I'm reasonably sure. And that was that he and perhaps others had decided that they needed a Democratic with a capital D voice in the opinion page of the Wall Street Journal. They tried out some Democrats who weren't able to write, in a way that the Wall Street Journal's audience would pay any attention to. And they finally came to me, and I guess I passed that test because I've been doing it now for 12 years. And to the great credit of the Journal, they have never attempted to censor me, to alter the views that I want to express in any way. The only thing they've done is to help me to say it better, more clearly, and with, fact checking and factual research to make sure that whatever view I'm expressing, it's based on ascertainable facts to the extent that they can be ascertained. And why am I doing it? Which is another part of your question. Answer, who would pass up an opportunity to speak to millions of people every week? I mean, some people might. For some people, writing a weekly column would just be unthinkable, too much of a burden. I won't say it's easy, but I wouldn't describe it as a burden either. I describe it as an opportunity, and it's an opportunity to speak in the voice of a moderate Democrat, which is what I've always been. I voted for Hubert Humphrey in my first election in 1968. I was not in the streets, and I wouldn't have been if although I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago. I was not with the protesters smelling the tear gas, which doesn't mean that I approved of what Mayor Daley was doing either. But that's a different matter. And through thick and thin, I have been that kind of Democrat. It made it really easy for me to work for people like Al Gore and then Bill Clinton. And since more strident voices tend to be heard, that's just the way it is. The opportunity for a voice like mine, to be heard for 12 years, by an audience that is reading an economically viable newspaper, a shrinking breed, as you probably know, who would say no to that? Not me.
We'll be right back. I want to go to your acknowledgments, and I'll read a little bit of the first paragraph and get you to expound on it. You say here, I recently read a book whose acknowledgments included expressions of gratitude to more than 200 individuals. I was envious and astounded. Writing this book was a painfully solitary task undertaken in the depth of the pandemic. I consulted no one until I completed the first draft, the inadequacies of which quickly became apparent. I began again with the same result. It was not until the third draft that I had the argument in the sequence in which it now appears, after which a round of edits consumed the better part of another year. You say it took 4 years to write this book. Give us a little idea of how much time you had to spend during those 4 years to get to this 150-page book.
Well, I think some sculptor once described the process, and it made it sound easy. You start with a block of marble, and you just, chip away everything that doesn't belong, and what's left is your statue. But there is something to that. That is, and that is my initial drafts, both the first and the second, contained material that got in the way of what I gradually realized was the central argument to the central theme. And to be honest, the pandemic gave me a lot of time to think about a lot of things, and I tried to cram too many of them into drafts 1 and 2. And, the people reading it, whether outside advisors or people at university presses, just said, this isn't working. And there was a point when I almost gave it up, when I encountered some technical difficulty. I thought I'd lost an entire chapter through inadvertence. And I worked with a technical advisor for more than an hour to retrieve that chapter. And if that technical retrieval had failed, I'm not sure we'd be talking about this book right now. But I meant every word of those acknowledgments, and I'm not saying that pridefully. I'm just trying to be honest about the process of composition. And frankly, if I'd been going around the country the way so many of my peers do, presenting chapters to academic or non-academic audiences, testing out the ideas, that would have been wonderful. But it's just not the way it worked out. And I'm very grateful to my colleague, Jonathan Rausch, who's, I think, reasonably well known in Washington and beyond as a clear-eyed thinker, for encouraging me to keep on going. I might have stopped otherwise. So it's to some extent, it's an accident that we're now talking about this book. But in another way, it's not, because I can now see my first book was published 50 years ago last month. And so I can now look back on the arc of my career and see that in one way or another, I've always been interested in the nature, the vulnerabilities, the strengths, and the best defenses of liberal democracy. By liberal democracy, I don't mean the opposite of conservative democracy. I mean liberal in the sense that the voice of the majority is always qualified by the rights of individuals, by the existence of sectors that are immune from governmental regulation, and or should be, and that this form of government, which I've come to understand, is hard to establish and even harder to maintain, is, I think, the best hope for mankind. And so it seemed like a worthy use of my life to try to understand it better, to defend it better, and to discover its structural weaknesses and try to abate them as best I could, either in theory or in practice, or both. And so this book is the latest chapter of this, multi-volume saga that I've written over the past 50 years, composed of, disparate elements, heterogeneous elements. It wasn't until I started looking back on all of them that I saw that there was an arc, which I've just described.
I have to read one more sentence from your acknowledgments. Only now do I understand a remark of Pascal I encountered as a graduate student to the effect that he would have written a shorter letter if he had had more time.
Yeah. Well, I've always treasured that quote. And, I note with interest that my books have gotten shorter and shorter, since the book for which I'm best known, which was published in, I believe, 1991, that I have gotten better. I have gotten better at slowing down, trying not to use 100 words if a 20-word sentence will do, and trying to write so that people outside my profession could understand me. But, when you're trying to edit yourself and clarify yourself, that takes time. It takes more time than if you just write in the academic language that you're taught to write in, especially as a graduate student, and reinforced by the way your colleagues and peers write, and such that if you don't use that language, what you produce may not be as highly regarded for purposes of publishing in journals and things of that sort. So, yeah, took a lot of time.
Well, it was certainly a refresher for me as I chased down all these different philosophers, but I went to Pascal and found this quote and wanted to ask you about it. All men's miseries derive from not being able to sit in a quiet room alone.
Well, that's another very famous quote. But I think that Pascal may have been talking about himself more than the general run of humanity. I mean, you don't have to be a deep reader of Aristotle to understand that when he said that man is a social and political animal, he was uttering a profound truth. And so we are designed as a species. I won't get into, the process of design. That's another conversation. We're designed as a species to associate. And when you associate, various things happen for good or ill, creating problems that it's the role of society and politics to try to solve or at least abate to the greatest extent possible. And so, if you do things because you're bored, or because you have excess energy that you need to blow off, and those two motives are incompatible with sitting quietly in a room by yourself, you can get into a lot of trouble. Footnote to every stupid teenage prank that has ever occurred. You're bored, so go out and, hotwire a car. Sure. In that sense, obviously, every parent knows that Pascal has a point. On the other hand, look at what happens to a lot of kids today who are sitting quietly in their rooms. That's not so great either. So, it's a quote that people remember, but the more you think about it, I think the more points of view from which you can question it.
How much of this book was motivated by Donald Trump?
Well, I talk about that. This is, I think this is not a book about Donald Trump, right? And I think Trump's name may appear 3 or 4 times. I'm sure Aristotle's name appears more frequently than Trump's does. Can't prove that, but certainly Aristotle had a bigger impact on this book than Donald Trump did by a long shot. But still, obviously, I was motivated to go deeper into these questions because of phenomena that I noted, in Donald Trump's emergence as a leading political figure in American politics. I think that's plain on its face. And I talk about my moment of realization that may have crystallized this book when I saw him as politics reduced to its essentials, which is, a man, yes, using technology, but a man using his voice to speak to multitudes and to motivate them and persuade them to move in the direction that he wanted them to. Right? And if you go back to Plato's dialogues, particularly the ones that reflect on politics, that really is the heart of the matter. Right? And so the Trump phenomenon, particularly the large rallies, stripped away everything that was extraneous and reminded me of the centrality of human persuasive speech to politics. As a matter of fact, if I were to try to define politics rigorously, that clause that I just uttered would be an integral part of that, right? Because there's a big difference between speaking to people one-on-one and speaking to them one-on-many, right? It's, to see politics as a one-on-many proposition is to see, I think, the heart of it, which is why 1/3 of this book is devoted to political speech, its uses and its misuses. I give examples of both.
This paragraph, I want you to comment on. During these years, millions of Americans who experience anger, this is all part of the title of your book, humiliation, resentment, and fear, struggled to express their sentiments in public life. As always happens, it took public speech to mobilize these passions and send them into battle. In this genre of rhetoric, effective speakers understand their audience's sentiments, often because they share them and give them voice. The goal is not to persuade, but to express what their audiences already believes. Donald Trump's speeches get him elected?
Yes. Without those speeches, no, Trump would not have been elected, because they were, and when he said, and at many of his speeches, I am your voice, he was expressing a literal truth, that he was speaking to people, who had become almost invisible to the leaders of both political parties. And he was saying, they're listening to other people, I'm listening to you, and I am giving voice, to what you're feeling. And, I understand you. I have to say that reminded me of another historical figure, Charles de Gaulle, who at the height of the Algerian conflict, delivered a famous speech to the French Algerians. I think he'd gone there and he said, je vous comprends. I understand you. And I have come to understand through this experience that the desire to be heard, to be respected by being attended to, is really much more fundamental than I had ever understood before. And that mirroring and playing back to people who feel misunderstood and ignored and overlooked in a way that conveys that you've heard them, and you're validating them. You're saying you're right and all the people who have dissed you are wrong. That's extremely powerful. And I think that without establishing that sense of intimate identification, with the people who show up as rallies, he would not have been elected the first time. If he hadn't been elected the first time, he certainly wouldn't have had another chance.
You say in the book that Abraham Lincoln gave two of the best speeches in history. And I wonder about this. And I know the nation's greatly divided, but you'll never hear anybody say Donald Trump gave two of the best speeches in history. Not, at least not on the, I don't know what side, the Trump people who support him might say that. But why is that? Because he's been so successful, and he is president, and you say speech is what made the difference.
Well, there can be a difference between great speeches and effective speech. And, I would give Donald Trump speeches, an F for composition, but an A for effectiveness. And what that tells you is, and I actually talk about this, is that speeches that appeal principally to the passions don't have to be models of composition. And I won't say that Lincoln was not appealing to our passions. I mean, he self-consciously did, but there's a reason why my subtitle refers to dark passions, to distinguish them from, what might be called light passions, or passions, that illuminate, a more positive path. And when Lincoln talked at the end of his first inaugural address, which I think is not one of his two greatest speeches, although it has many high moments, when he appealed to the mystic chords of memory, that connect us, to each other as fellow Americans, he was trying to summon up an experience of commonality, a sense of what we shared that couldn't be reduced to propositions necessarily, but was a feeling, a positive feeling, which he was appealing to in the hopes of desperately trying to ward off the Civil War at the very last moment before it broke out. And if you look at the end of Lincoln's second inaugural address, which was one of his two greatest speeches, and I think I would rate the closing of that speech even above the Gettysburg Address. You see him invoking the awe and majesty of God as a perspective that he was encouraging his listeners to take, to feel the sense of a theological awe at the events of the 4 years of the Civil War, and to respond to it with awe and even a measure of fear, as a divine verdict on the entire country. I mean, I wouldn't say that was the kind of appeal to logic that so dominated the Gettysburg Address. But it was powerful. And who knows what would have happened if Lincoln had lived and could have brought that perspective to binding up the nation's wounds, of dealing with his fellow Americans, charity towards all and malice for none, right? Who knows? History might have been very different. But all of this is to say that there are different kinds of speeches, and Lincoln's first inaugural was a practical failure. It did not ward off the Civil War, which was the purpose of the speech to achieve. And from that standpoint, Donald Trump's speeches were, I think, from a rhetorical point of view, crude but enormously effective. And he changed people's minds. He took a party that had been a free trade party and turned it into a protectionist party. He took a party that had been opposed to the Soviet Union and then Russia, and turned it into a party that respected Russia because allegedly Vladimir Putin and his buddies represent traditional values. You can believe that. You can believe anything. And I could go on. But, well, I'm nattering on now. So I'll just stop and we'll proceed to your next question.
We'll be right back. People always ask how we choose books and invite people. And we don't, necessarily expect everybody to say yes, but I just wanted you to know and have you give me some feedback on it. I asked you to do this interview because of another columnist, and that columnist was David Brooks. And he said in this huge piece in the New York Times, Bill Galston's new book, he said it's a fantastic new book. And I wonder, that's when you see that, I mean, that was my reaction. If it's fantastic, I got to see it. And has that helped you in raising the visibility of this particular book?
I'd be an idiot to say no. Of course it has, right? David Brooks is read and respected by millions of Americans. I can tell you that, in the corridors of the Yale University Press, joy reigned triumphant when they read that. And I have to believe that being praised that highly in one of the best read commentators on American politics and culture in the country, got to be a big positive. Do I know what would have happened differently if he hadn't written that? Well, I can already rack up one item, that is to say, we wouldn't be talking. So, yeah, and I have to believe that your reaction to that was not idiosyncratic in any way. So, and I am doing a lot of public talks. I'm doing a lot of dialogues like this one, though this one is better than all the rest, frankly. But still, yeah, it made a big difference.
Another thing that I noticed, and I wanted to I'm talking really about connections and how people succeed in this world of writing and all. You quote in the book and you thank Martha Nussbaum. Tell us who she is and why you have such respect for her.
Well, first of all, she's probably the single best known American philosopher around the world, and has received all sorts of international awards as well as domestic recognition. And she has spent a lot of time talking about the emotions in politics. Now, as it happens, if you follow my comments about her and my footnotes, that I express at several points profound disagreement with the views on the passions and emotions that she has expressed, especially as they apply to politics. But I thank her for helping to open up those questions, because frequently what matters most is the questions that you choose to ask, because the questions are good. They will create a kind of a force field within which different views that might not have emerged will emerge and, connect with each other, collide with each other. But it's an important conversation. And, she has a very high regard for the Stoics, for example. For all sorts of reasons, I can't identify with them the way she does, but I thank her, for raising their visibility and representing that as more of a live option than many people before her had, and that started something. But I wouldn't want to confuse or have your listeners confuse respect with agreement, because in very important ways, I take the dark passions a lot more seriously than she does. She thinks that the light passions are much more of an actual public motivation in politics than I think history will bear. And so I am, to put it as simply as possible, I am more pessimistic about human nature and therefore political possibilities than I think she is.
One of the reasons I brought up the David Brooks thing is to talk about connections and all that. And I looked this up. Martha Nussbaum is influenced by John Rawls. John Rawls is influenced by Martha Nussbaum. And I don't know that I pronounced this right. Amartya Sen is influenced by Martha Nussbaum, and she is also influenced by John Rawls. I mean, this back and forth and all this stuff. Who's John Rawls, by the way?
John Rawls is arguably the most famous political philosopher of the past 50 years. He died a few years ago in his 80s, but he published a book, I believe it was in 1971, called A Theory of Justice, which revolutionized the field of political philosophy and in many important respects resuscitated it, because the popular view in the 1950s and the 1960s was that political philosophy was dead. And one famous political philosopher actually said so. And so he is credited with reviving it and moving it to the center of conversation. Although his book is long and extremely complicated and technical and not written in language for non-philosophers, I think that, everybody could understand one of his basic conclusions, which he called the difference principle, in which he said that inequality is justified only to the extent that it maximizes the well-being of the least advantaged member of society. So if you can look at economic inequality and say, well, if the people on top were poorer, then the people on the bottom would be poorer too. Right? It wasn't the question of a fixed pie necessarily, but people at the top behaving in ways that conveyed maximum benefits to the people farther down the economic ladder, then and only then would existing inequalities be justified. Now, what that means in practice and what you have to go through analytically to apply it to concrete reality is much more complicated, but that principle in itself has evoked decades of discussion, disagreement, exegesis, you name it. So that's who he is. And there's a period of some decades during which I would say 90% of Anglo-American political philosophy, represented in one way or another a commentary on John Rawls' theory of justice and the articles and books that he wrote subsequently in an effort to clarify what was left unclear in a theory of justice.
Let me go. By the way, whose idea? I know our audience can't see this, but whose idea was it for the cover? Which I'll describe it as it's a microphone that's on fire.
Well, it wasn't mine, I can tell you that. And I think, and I was told anyway, that in some sort of editorial meeting, there was a lively discussion about a cover that would, let's say, diverge significantly from the usual staid Yale University Press cover. And I guess they decided, and I have to tell you, when they first sent it to me, I was flabbergasted. I'd never written a book with a cover like that, and I had rarely encountered a book with a cover like that, but they thought they had, a property that might, if it were, let's say, I was about to say sensationalized, but let me dial that back a little, souped up, that it might break through or have a better chance of breaking through. It certainly was not my idea, and I had deep doubts about it, to tell you the truth. I thought it might detract, from the tone that I tried to strike of relative sobriety. But if it gets people to open up the book, then the marketers of the press were right, and old, stodgy, squeamish me was dead wrong.
Give us a little bit of a definition on the three words that are on your cover from your point of view. Let's start with anger.
Mm-hmm.
Define that.
Well, I'm not sure I can define anger, but I think we all know from personal experience what it means to get angry, what it means to experience rage, right? Anger, I think, typically occurs as a distinctive phenomenon when someone commits a particular act that evokes that emotion of displeasure and, disagreement, that we call anger. And I distinguish anger from hatred by saying that anger is directed to specific actions. Hatred is directed at persons or groups of persons. And anger is hot. Hatred can be cold. Anger can be relieved with an apology or rectification. But if you hate someone, there's very little of anything that person can do, to cease being an object of your hatred. And, one scholar defined Hitler Germany as the only regime anywhere and ever motivated only by the murderous hatred for the Jews. And, one of the most pathetic experiences of the 1930s was Jewish veterans of World War I who had won Iron Crosses for bravery, during that, conflict, showing up with their Iron Crosses in the belief that visible demonstration and proof of German patriotism would save them. Nothing would save them, because if you are hated for who or what you are, boy, it's hard to change that. But everybody knows how, sincere apologies, rectification, the determination, credible vow to do better in the future can help relieve anger. And as a matter of fact, if you do it properly, the moral burden then shifts to the person who is angry with you to forgive you. And there's an elaborate literature on that subject, some of which is psychological, some of which is philosophical, some of which is theological, but it all points in the same direction. So the distinction between anger and hatred, I think, is pretty clear. But there is a family of experiences that I talk about under the rubric of anger, including the sense of humiliation. When you are treated in such a way that, it has the effect of depriving you of your dignity, or is intended to deprive you of your dignity. I do an extended riff, for example, on the ceremony, with which Captain Dreyfus, was stripped of his military identity and publicly degraded, as an example of public humiliation. But I talk a lot of others, and including the experience that entire countries have. The Chinese have a phrase, the century of national humiliation, that occurred from, the 1840s and the occupation of substantial portions of China by colonial powers to the 1940s, when, as the Chinese still say, the nation stood up in their revolution. Of course, it was a communist revolution, so things have not gone entirely well since then, but they haven't gone entirely badly either, I think we have to confess. The humiliation, I've already mentioned the humiliation of Germany after World War I, which Hitler played on in all of his speeches. And he pledged to overcome the humiliation of Versailles. And it is no accident that the French surrender to Germany, Hitler's stage managed to occur in exactly the same railroad car, that Germany had had in effect surrendered to the Allies 2 decades earlier. So, humiliation and the resentment that humiliation creates can be an extraordinarily powerful driver in politics. And the force of resentment, which I've written about in more practical political contexts, how Americans who felt that they had been left behind, came to resent elites in both political parties, providing some of the emotional fuel, for the rise of the Tea Party and then a populist movement and then Donald Trump, et cetera. So those are some of the things that I cover in my chapter on anger.
You could have picked a lot of words to put on the cover. The other two, and I ask you first about fear.
Mm-hmm.
How do you describe fear?
Well, fear, and here I just, crib from Aristotle. I'm glad that all of his works are in the public domain, because otherwise he could sue me for plagiarism, but it is, fear is the anticipation of something bad that will happen to you. It looks forward, you see the bear, emerging from the woods, you're camping, and you've read a lot of stories about how campers get mauled by bears. You think that could happen to you, and and then you react. There's the famous fight or flight dyad, but there's a third. There's a third reaction to fear, and that is freezing, the famous deer in the headlights. And the reason that turns out to be so important, becomes apparent and connects to the theme of the book through one of Franklin D. Roosevelt's most famous speeches, his first inaugural address, where he tells his fellow countrymen, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And then he says why. He talks about the unreasoning terror that paralyzes us and prevents us from acting, to get out of the hole that we're in. And, I have thought very hard about Roosevelt's selection of the word paralyzes to describe, the effects of stark, unreasoning terror because of his own personal biography, right? Where, he was struck down in the prime of his life by a disease that paralyzed him physically and could have paralyzed him emotionally. And he went through some dark nights of the soul before figuring out that he could not only live with this, but go forward with it. And I have to believe that his experience of overcoming that form of fear that we call terror, fueled the optimism, the contagious optimism with which he took over the country and reassured his fellow Americans. He famously said in that same speech, our ills, thank God, involve only material things, right? That the country had gone through an economic plunge, an unprecedented national plunge, but the essentials of what we needed to recover were still intact, right? And so while acknowledging our economic ills, he also lightened them in speech. We can overcome this because our institutions are still intact, because the will of the American people, its skills, its drives, still there. We can do this, my fellow countrymen. And it worked, right? One of the most remarkable examples of a speech addressed by name to a public sentiment, one of the sentiments that I talk about in the book, a potentially debilitating public sentiment that that turned out to be malleable. That if the opposition of fear is confidence, justified confidence, then, because there's such a thing as unjustified confidence. The bear ambles towards you, and maybe you've lifted weights or something. You think of yourself as a very sturdy fellow. I can do this. I can take on this bear. Well, there's some circumstances in which confidence could kill, right? But if your confidence is justified by the facts of the matter, and you can persuade others to be confident as well, that can be very powerful. But on the other side, and I talk about this in my chapter on fear can be used to manipulate people. And you're afraid of X. Well, your fears are justified, and this is what we can do about X. And suppose the X's turn out to be immigrants, right? And there are some very legitimate bases for fear of immigration that is not legal, that is not regulated, that doesn't take into account the impact of immigrants on local areas and populations. I mean, all of that is open for discussion and legislation. But this sort of undifferentiated fear of the other, the fear that these people are so different that they're stealing your pets and roasting them and eating them, right? What human being would do that, is the implication. There are false fears, that can lead us in dangerous directions. And that's one reason why I talk about fear. And I go through an extended analysis of what it is we fear, either legitimately or not so legitimately. I'm just trying, I'm not really making an argument about fear so much as I am describing it in enough detail so that people can recognize it in its different manifestations.
Earlier, I listed a whole bunch of philosophers and people that you quote, but we're running out of time, so I have to ask you one last question. How did philosopher John Lennon and Patrick Mahomes make it into your book?
Well, we live in a country, in a public culture, in which a lot of the lines between highbrow, middlebrow, and mass entertainment or mass culture have eroded. When I was a boy and a teenager, those lines were pretty much hard and fast. We don't live in that country anymore. We live in a country in which people freely, some people would say promiscuously, make references across every conceivable line. And so if a reference to John Lennon's famous song, Imagine, will help illustrate a point of view that I'm flatly opposed to in this book, so much the better, right? And, Patrick Mahomes represents a certain kind of excellence and a certain kind of drive and determination, et cetera. If I can convey that by citing him as an example, so much the better. I'm interested in being understood, and I'm not proud. I'm not too proud to use the instruments of being understood that are available to us in the times in which I'm writing.
The name of the book is, we have said earlier, Anger, Fear, Domination, Dark Passions, and the Power of Political Speech. William Galston, our guest, thank you so much for your time.
This has been terrific. Thank you so much, Brian.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Book Notes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.